And good to see some interest in this question. It's an important question, so the title of the presentation is On the Goodness of Whitehead's God, a Defense in Metaphysical Interpretation. So I want to start with a question straight away. Namely, are process theologians guilty of romanticizing the so-called benevolence of Whitehead's God? So what I'm going to try to do is answer in the negative, and therefore defend the goodness of Whitehead's God against recent claims to the contrary. So these claims have come from Pier Francisco Basel and Peter Sjöstedt-Hughes, both of which have effectively renewed doubt, I would say, in the goodness of Whitehead's God. Now they're resonant in their critiques, and in the case of Sjöstedt-Hughes, deliberately provocative in nature. What is more, they both share a certain skepticism of the Claremont tradition of process theology. For example, in commenting rightly that Whitehead's thought has been stronger in the United States, Basel points to the vigorous, yet unfortunately somewhat militant school of process philosophy and theology that took shape around the remarkable figures of Harcher, Cobb, and Griffin. As to what it is that is militant in the Claremont tradition, however, Basel leaves unarticulated. Yet his statements from an earlier book may give a clue. To the extent that process theologians like Cobb and Griffin have given the impression that Whitehead was concerned to defend Christian belief by providing it with a new metaphysical basis, Basel objects, saying this would be a misinterpretation of Whitehead's aim. Now, I would certainly agree that Whitehead was not a Christian apologist in this way, and I trust both Cobb and Griffin would as well. However, whether you like it or not, Whitehead still was clearly impacted by and concerned with Christianity, both its religious and metaphysical insight as well as its continual evolution. Now, similarly to Basel, Sjöstedt-Hughes' neo-pagan Nietzschean interpretation of Whitehead creatively combats what he calls the attempted Christian hijack of Whitehead's metaphysics under the name of process theology. The reality of the matter for Sjöstedt-Hughes is that Whitehead's religion has little affinity with Christianity and is in fact largely anti-Christian in essence. Again, the language used here by Basel and Sjöstedt-Hughes is notable in its hyperbole. Christian process theologians are militant and hijackers. What is really behind this language, I take it, is the conviction that process theologians have co-opted Whitehead's theology for their own religious or theological interests, and in ways that are disingenuous to Whitehead himself. Okay, never mind the fact that Whitehead specifically offers suggestions to Protestant clergy as to how Christian theology should develop. Now, certainly, if Whitehead's God is not good, there is little affinity between Christianity and his God, and we should be baffled at the prevalence of Christian process theology. We should also be baffled at Whitehead's failed attempt to justify the so-called goodness of God in the face of evil, the problem of evil being a well-known existential issue for him that I think must necessarily be downgraded by any claim that his God is less than good. So, are process theologians simply misinformed? So I want to look briefly to the work of Basel and Sjöstedt-Hughes and engage with them a bit. Now, despite Basel's acknowledgement that the consequent nature of Whitehead's God, in contrast to Aristotle's unmoved mover, is both religiously insightful and existentially relevant, he nevertheless rightly notes that Whitehead does at times provide descriptions of God that make one seriously wonder whether the proposed theology can offer the sort of existential inspiration not solely religious people, but most thoughtful persons crave for. Now, Basel cites a single paragraph passage from Process and Reality that contains what he thinks are some particularly troubling statements. For example, that God's purpose seeks intensity and not preservation. That God in his primordial nature is unmoved by love for this particular or that particular. That in the foundations of God's being, God is indifferent alike to preservation and to novelty. And that God's aim for the world is depth of aesthetic satisfaction as an intermediate step towards the fulfillment of his own being. For Basel, these statements cast a sinister light upon Whitehead's God, who he thinks does not seem to be much interested in the well-being of the temporal occasions or be animated by any moral considerations. It's worth noting, however, that Basel has left out the sentence that immediately follows and concludes the paragraph, namely, that God's tenderness is directed towards each actual occasion as it arises. Still, Basel thinks that when presenting a form for realization, God is not aiming at what is best for actuality. His aim is rather to turn the world into an as beautiful object as possible so that the divine subsequent incorporation would be as intense as possible. Indeed, Basel quickly insists that God is unmoved by any moral impulse but by aesthetic considerations. In saying that worldly occasions too are advised to strive for the maximum of intensity in their experiences, Basel comments saying, "This is a strange view indeed, as there is no intrinsic connection between the notions of depth of satisfaction and morally right. On the contrary, intensity of experience may even be achieved in immoral ways. Whereas Basil's earlier conviction saw the consequent nature as a caring, loving father, quite different from Aristotle's unmoved mover, he now insists that from the point of view of a suffering human being, this conception of God is hardly likely to appear better than Aristotle's notion of a self-loving deity, and that there is in fact nothing here that justifies thinking of Whitehead's God as a caring, loving father. Now, if this passage is a definitive statement of Whitehead's God, which is hardly the case, then Basil may be right to insist that Whitehead has not dealt any better than his predecessors with the problem of evil. Okay, God cannot be blamed for evil, but neither can God eradicate it from the world's history, according to Basil. Whitehead's God, Basil thinks, is not the world's creator. In pointing to one of Whitehead's darker moods, he quotes the statement, "Life is robbery," and notes his condemnation of Leibniz for trying to save the face of the creator by his theory of the best possible worlds. Ultimately, Basil is adamant that the indifference of Whitehead's own God to our present and forthcoming suffering does not make him truly worthy of any great admiration. And while it may be said that God saves us in the consequent nature, Basil notes, that, as if it could be otherwise on Whitehead's scheme, that this is only after catastrophes of all sorts have already occurred. Thus, to the question, how good is Whitehead's God, Basil answers, saying, Whitehead's theory of a primarily egoistic God who saves us when all things have already taken place would appear as morally repulsive as Leibniz's theory of the best of all possible worlds. In fact, for Basil, Whitehead underestimates the difficulties in his own conception of God when he states that God is a little oblivious to morals. Basil thus admits to remaining deeply perplexed by the dark side of Whitehead's God. So what can be said by way of a brief response to Basil's assessment? I'd say perhaps most galling is that he's highlighted a single passage from Process and Reality as if it were a decisive statement from which to judge whether or not Whitehead's God is good. So I would submit that this is not acceptable or responsible as a serious interpreter of Whitehead's God. So in elevating this statement, Basil openly ignores various other statements that Whitehead makes across his corpus, many of which I think would ease his existential anxiety. So another problem I see with Basil's elevation of this passage is that he neglects to include the fact that Whitehead is speaking, as he often does, of the primordial nature in abstraction from the consequent nature. While it certainly sounds religiously or morally offensive to hear that the primordial nature is unmoved by love for various particulars in the world, or that in the foundations of God's being, God is indifferent, this is spoken, I would submit, in isolation from the consequent nature of which it can never coherently be separated. In a similar way, as Basil knows, Whitehead tells us that the primordial nature in and of itself is deficiently actual. It lacks the fullness of feeling and is in fact unconscious. Again, if this is all God is, I would fully grant the religious and moral objection. However, God is not just an abstract primordial nature, but a dipolar union of primordial and consequent natures, that is, as a whole, conscious, feeling, and moved by the sufferings of the world, moved even by love. In his previous book, Basil even emphasized that God's consequent and primordial natures are not to be conceived as distinct parts that could exist independently from one another, but as distinct aspects of a single reality. However, instead of seeing this troubling passage as yet another example of Whitehead wobbling in abstraction, that's Whitehead's term, Basil, I submit, has himself inappropriately treated the primordial nature as a distinct part. The fact that he can at once speak of God's supposed indifference to our suffering while also knowing Whitehead's insistence that God is the fellow sufferer who understands would seem to undergird or deepen this point. Thus, to take proper account, I think, of the abstraction Whitehead uses in his statements, not just this one, but quite a few, would I think necessitate a different interpretation than the one Basil has given. What is more, in the context of the many statements Whitehead makes about God, the fact that God seeks intensity and not preservation is not, I think, grounds for denying the goodness or moral admirability to God. I don't think Whitehead thought that. Contrary to Basil, there is no inherent incompatibility between morality and aesthetics in Whitehead's God. The divine pursuit of aesthetic intensity at one level, say the electron or the cell, is certainly devoid of moral considerations as we understand them. However, at the high evolutionary level of human or animal minds, both aesthetic and moral considerations are replete. As Whitehead states in Adventures of Ideas, there is that other form of beauty which is rightness of conduct. While it's true that a state of affairs can be aesthetically intense but ruinous and evil, Auschwitz for example, God pursues those states of affairs that are aesthetically intense, both harmonious and good, or at least as good as they can be given the context, which admittedly might be the lesser of two evils. We may not like that, but it seems to be a condition of our being. Now we're going to revisit this in the context of Sjöstedt-Hughes, and then later in the context of Whitehead's clear association of the moral and aesthetic nature of divinity. But neither, we should say, is the fact that life is robbery, or the fact that there is for Whitehead no best possible world a hit against divine goodness. Rather, these are metaphysical concomitants of his process universe. So Basil, in fact, neglects to mention that Whitehead follows the statement, life is robbery, with the insistence that it is at this point with life that morals become acute. The robber requires justification. Mm-hmm. For Whitehead, the basis of moral justification is metaphysical and ultimately theological in nature. And in his earlier book, Basil even suggests this, saying that several passages of Whitehead suggest that he holds the so-called moral argument, the Kantian claim that our experience of moral obligation can be made intelligible only by postulating the reality of God as an ultimate standard of value. So I think it's odd to have made that statement, only to now take issue with Whitehead's claim that God is a little oblivious to morals. So in context, the statement is hardly the claim that God is morally oblivious or indifferent. Again, this would rightly beckon religious and moral protest. Whitehead's claim is rather a denial that God is concerned with the rigid and unchanging codification of morality. Okay, this is a fault he repeatedly associates with dysfunctional theological and religious systems. Basil, moreover, disregards the fact that Whitehead clearly utters this statement in the context of love as found in the Galilean origin of Christianity, which, as Whitehead famously states, does not emphasize the ruling Caesar, the ruthless moralist, or the unmoved mover. Okay, some of these being for Whitehead clear examples of idolatrous theistic symbolism is the way he expresses that. Rather, we know the passage, it dwells upon the tender elements of the world which slowly and in quietness operate by love. Love neither rules nor is it unmoved. Also, it is a little oblivious to morals. So that's the context. I think Basil's contextual omission here, coupled with his prior, albeit apparently forgotten signal as to Whitehead's moral argument, casts major doubt on his claim that Whitehead's God is morally repulsive. And we're going to see further that Whitehead's claims themselves also discredit, I think, this perspective. So let's now turn briefly to the work of Sjöstedt-Hughes, who offers what I think is really a wonderfully creative integration of psychedelic exploration and metaphysical interpretation, producing a paganization of Whitehead's God. So Sjöstedt-Hughes readily acknowledges his intention to emphasize the darker, nihilistic aspects of the God whom Whitehead speaks, and thus to bond this representation with the shadowy facets of psychedelic phenomena, and to distance him or her from the rather mawkish idolatry she's received in much process discussion. Now Sjöstedt-Hughes, again, a friend, has in mind those process theologians who would disingenuously produce a portrait of Whitehead's God that is friendly to Christian utilization and expression. Note that now, in addition to being militant and hijackers, Sjöstedt-Hughes now casts the sin of idolatry upon process theologians. Yet one need only juxtapose Sjöstedt-Hughes' use of idolatry to Whitehead's, as just mentioned, to see a kind of irony here. Whitehead uses the language in the context of the Galilean Christian intuitions of persuasive love, corrective intuitions that point one away from what he says is idolatrous theistic symbolism. So this hyperbole notwithstanding, Sjöstedt-Hughes' efforts at paganization are not without standing in Whitehead, especially if you, once again, abstract particular passages to this kind of purpose. For example, he finds justification when Whitehead states that the function of God is analogous to the remorseless workings of things in Greek and Buddhist thought. The ruthlessness of God can be personified as Eti, the goddess of mischief. What is more, when contrasting the nature and origins of creation in Nutum Scholium and Plato's Timaeus, Sjöstedt-Hughes plays up Whitehead's poetic nod to the function of Satan in his journey across chaos as expressed in Milton's epic Paradise Lost. Here, Sjöstedt-Hughes quickly claims, is Whitehead's identification with Satan, with the god of his philosophy. Indeed, Sjöstedt-Hughes would put it even stronger, saying Whitehead's God is, in fact, the devil. This conviction is not only informed for him by this Milton passage, but also by his own conviction that Whitehead's God is neither omnipotent, omniscient, or omnibenevolent. Neither is God the highest principle, since according to Sjöstedt-Hughes, creativity stands above God. Never mind the fact that any ranking, whether superior or inferior, or above or below, dissolves when seen in terms of Whitehead's real position, namely the mutual ultimacy and immanence of creativity and God. Still, Sjöstedt-Hughes concludes that the word God is hardly appropriate, and we can still maintain with Nietzsche that Gott is tot, if we concede that Whitehead commits a death by 1,000 qualifications. So with the theism of Whitehead's pantheism, now God, the great God Pan, has been reborn, and for Sjöstedt-Hughes is far from dead. Now, like Basil, God's goodness is questionable for Sjöstedt-Hughes because of Whitehead's claim that God's purpose is in the creative advance is the evocation of intensities as an absolute end. Indeed, Whitehead does find the foundation of the world in aesthetic experience and claims that the moral order is merely certain aspects of the aesthetic order. Again, however, that aesthetic value is the most fundamental kind of value applicable to the universe is not, in my opinion, a denial of the importance of moral value. There are stages of the universe where moral value is simply not applicable for Whitehead, but there is no stage of the universe where aesthetic value is not applicable. Okay, so that aesthetic value is deeper in this way than moral value is a statement, I think, as to its evolutionary roots and origins, not a statement as to its subordination, certainly not its irrelevance. Still, Sjöstedt-Hughes maintains that Whitehead's moral relativism is a result of subordinating morality to aesthetics. For Whitehead, the world is in flux, and so moral systems are as well. Morality, he states, thus consists in belief systems that instantiate intensities of emotion, but cannot substantiate their absolute objectivity. Thus, for Sjöstedt-Hughes, Dionysus would really be a more suitable icon for Whitehead's desirous deity. He not only finds support in Basil's insistence that Whitehead's theory of a primarily egoistic God is morally repulsive, he also points to Victor Lowe, who conveyed that Whitehead's God was seen as an aesthete of highly dubious moral character, not worthy of being called God. Should be clarified, however, that this was not Lowe's position, but that of Stephen Lee Ellie, an early critic of Whitehead's God, whom Lowe is referencing. As an aside, Ellie once recommended we assign yet another metaphysical aspect to Whitehead's God, what he called a diabolic nature. So Sjöstedt-Hughes, in fact, neglects to mention that only a few pages later in this in the context of Lowe's book, Lowe had stated rather definitively that the divine attribute that Whitehead keeps and makes central is goodness. So has Whitehead's famed biographer missed something? What we see in Sjöstedt-Hughes' assessment of Whitehead's God is similar to Basil, although I'd say less sympathetic religiously, namely an exercise in abstraction in relation to Whitehead's many statements of God. Now, with respect to God as Eti, the goddess of mischief that drives this remorseless workings of things, Whitehead clearly speaks in terms of analogy and personification. That God is analogously personified as mischievous is not the claim that God is mischievous. Similarly, that God's function is analogous to the literary figure of Satan, as expressed in Milton's epic, is not the claim that God is Satan. Now, God may be experienced as mischievous, ruthless, perhaps even satanic, okay, depending on what you mean by that term. Because God seeks intensity rather than preservation in a layered world that often resists novelty and intensity for preservation and comfort. We may not like this, but again, if it were otherwise, I don't think we would ever have emerged in the first place. So this is, again, I'd say, not grounds to say God is not good. Rather, it's grounds to consider what a truly processive vision requires of our understanding of divine activity. So I find what Sjöstedt-Hughes calls the poetic ingression used to emphasize these darker and nihilistic aspects of Whitehead somewhat ironic, especially when juxtaposed to Whitehead's own theopoetic insistence that God is the poet of the world, with tender patience, leading it by his vision of truth, beauty, and goodness.
Yeah.
I was trying to get interaction. So now that Whitehead's God is in fact the devil for Sjöstedt-Hughes follows upon his insistence that Whitehead is a moral relativist, and he cites the following passage for modes of thought in support of this claim. There is no one behavior system belonging to the essential character of the universe as the universal moral ideal. Ellipsis. Thus, morality does not indicate what you are to do in mythological abstractions. It does concern the general ideal which should be the justification for any partial objective. The destruction of man, an insect, a tree, the Parthenon may be moral or immoral. Now, Sjöstedt-Hughes is right that Whitehead fully recognizes, as we all must, a multitude of moral beliefs and systems that are always and everywhere in flux. This is yet another metaphysical attendant to his process universe. So if moral relativism means many competing moralities, this is obvious and is a rather weak form of moral relativity, say. More a claim about moral plurality rather than a true moral relativism. In other words, it's not the stronger claim that there is no ontological basis for morality as such. It should be noted, again, that the wider context of Whitehead's statements here from modes of thought is, again, his rejection of a rigid codification of morality, which is not, he says, any more unqualified than the laws of nature. Quote, "The notion of the unqualified stability of particular laws of nature and of particular moral codes is the primary illusion which has vitiated much philosophy." So while he fully admits that moral codifications are useful and indeed essential for civilization, he also rightly insists that we weaken their influence by exaggerating their status. So such moral systems may indeed be unable to substantiate their objectivity, their absolute objectivity, as Sjöstedt-Hughes states. After all, moral systems are always imperfect attempts to instantiate the good in human affairs. But is there no good as such? Is there no real basis from which to speak of moral improvement at all? A true metaphysical moral relativism, I submit, would deny any objective good and thus any ontological basis to moral claims, duties, and improvement whatsoever. This Whitehead, I think, certainly denies. Okay, our moral intuitions are something that is there in the nature of things. Well, we could say there is a metaphysical good which our moral intuitions dimly grasp, but it's always finite, contextual, and imperfect in its realization. For Whitehead, this goes for our civilization, as well as for any of the billions of civilizations that likely populate our universe. Still, as he states, in the context of that kind of statement, all realization of the good is finite and necessarily excludes certain other types. As a quick aside, if you are interested in the question of other worlds, intelligent extraterrestrial life in Whitehead, I have a book on the way and a larger volume on the way too, so we can talk about it. So the good for Whitehead is not nothing, nor is it nowhere. Rather, it is arguably in God, alongside truth and beauty, which together constitute the axiological depths of the divine life and purpose. Contrary to Sjöstedt-Hughes' claim, there is no obvious subordination of goodness to beauty in God. Rather, truth, beauty, and goodness are the motivating values of divine poiesis in the universe. It is these objective ideals, we might say, that imperfectly color our finite moral strivings and undergird the reality of moral progress, which, as Whitehead states, gradually emerge in the slow sunrise of 1,000 years. That statement. So it's worth noting again the ellipsis that is included in Sjöstedt-Hughes' statement for modes of thought. It's a statement about morality. The ellipsis actually shields us, I think, from an important claim Whitehead makes with respect to morality, namely that what is universal is the spirit which should permeate any behavior system and the circumstances of its adoption. So far from being a moral relativist, Whitehead holds, I'd say, to the universality of a moral kind of spirit that ultimately extends from the moral nature of divinity. Now, having shed light on some of the darker angles taken by Basel and Sjöstedt-Hughes in analyzing Whitehead's God, let's now turn to a few of the more explicit statements that Whitehead himself makes on this issue. So as indicated already, in order to draw a negative conclusion on the question, it seems these statements must be roundly ignored. And yet to not take account of them is to render premature any conviction that Whitehead's God is less than good. In fact, from Science in the Modern World to his final essay, Immortality, I don't think Whitehead ever lost sight of the divine goodness. So I want to try to demonstrate that now by attending to just a few examples. In his first ever chapter on God and Science in the Modern World, Whitehead discusses the necessity of antecedent limitation or determination among possibilities and values affected through an envisioning mode of a kind of divine activity. There must be some kind of divine ground for limitation, Whitehead insists, but what is the nature of this ground and its limitations? It is here for the first time that Whitehead openly rejects metaphysical complements that would make God the foundation of the metaphysical situation with its ultimate activity. Why is this? Whitehead answers, if this conception be adhered to, there can be no alternative except to assign God the origin of all evil as well as all good. This he clearly denies. Okay? God is not, it's a new term I learned, agathokekological. God is not an admixture of good and evil. Rather, if God be conceived as the supreme ground of limitation, Whitehead continues, then it stands in God's very nature to divide the good from the evil. Now, ironically, according to Stephen Lee Eley, this early critic, this is Whitehead's assertion without explanation that God is good. It's interesting, again, to hear this coming from Eley, who was a sort of forerunner to these criticisms that Basel and Sjöstedt-Hughes are offering, at least in part. Nonetheless, here in Whitehead's early ruminations of God as the supreme ground of limitation, we see what seems to be an overt association of goodness with the divine nature. This nature is good, and the limitations it affects in securing or procuring the rise of value in the world process are on behalf of good. Now, Whitehead would continue precisely this theme of limitation and goodness in religion in the making. Denying again that God is agothic ecological, he states it is not true that God is in all respects infinite. If he were, he would be evil as well as good. This, Whitehead thinks, is an incoherent claim since, quote, this unlimited fusion of evil with good would mean mere nothingness. On the contrary, he insists that God is something decided and is thereby limited. As for the nature of this limitation in God, Whitehead again seems to be overt, saying the limitation of God is his goodness. Now, contrary to confused attempts of the theological tradition, God for Whitehead cannot be both unlimited and good. Rather, if God provides limitations on behalf of good, then God's own limitation in some sense must be conceived in terms of goodness. Now, in Process and Reality, Whitehead continues to uphold God's goodness. In discussing the interplay of the primordial and consequent natures, he again seems overt, saying God's necessary goodness expresses the determination of his consequent nature, and the perfection of God's subjective aim derived from the completeness of his primordial nature issues into the character of his consequent nature. What we see here correlated is not only ambiguously goodness and divine necessity, a point I'm going to end with, but also goodness as a mode of divine perfection. Only after these statements we see Whitehead then making a host of soteriological statements, using soteriological language. God saves the good that was achieved despite destructive evil. Okay, this is a salvific aim that again is rooted in the divine poetic function, which is led by truth, beauty, and goodness. Now, to jump ahead to his final essay, Immortality, Whitehead makes a variety of claims as to God's nature and function in the world, but they're hidden beneath a lot of creative usage of language, so I recommend it to everybody. It's a great article. And it's here that Whitehead states without elaboration that God's existence is founded in value and is to be conceived as persuasive towards an ideal coordination in the world. God's activity with respect to the world of value, he states, concerns the timeless coordination of the infinitude of possibility for realization, and the divine nature, conceived as the unification derived from the world, is founded on ideals of perfection, moral and aesthetic. So note here again that ideals of both moral and aesthetic perfection seem to be associated with God's nature and activity in the world. Of course, Whitehead says we're unable to conceive the experience of the supreme unity of existence, but these are the human terms in which we can glimpse the origin of that drive toward limited perfections, or limited ideals of perfection which haunt the universe. So, again, the purpose of this discussion is to attempt to offer defense of Whitehead's God, and thus to cast doubt upon these recent claims made by Basil and Sjöstedt-Hughes. So that Whitehead's God be deemed dark, cold, egoistic, narcissistic, hedonistic, nihilistic, morally repulsive, and sinister, okay, all words coming from Basil and Sjöstedt-Hughes, is simply a result of hyperbolic abstraction, and in part, rebellion against the likes of Christian process theology. Whitehead, of course, made no claims to completion with respect to his doctrine of God, and we've seen that he does certainly make ambiguous and challenging statements that lead one to question his meanings and offer their own interpretations. Interpretive care is required, however. We should be careful to not over-elevate certain statements to the neglect of others or abstract them from the wider context of his writing. This is a challenge for all of us Whiteheadians. So in their narrow focus on some passages rather than others, Basil and Sjöstedt-Hughes have neglected to take wider account of Whitehead's affirmations of divine goodness. And insofar as they've done this, I think they've misrepresented Whitehead's God, and also, I'd say, we'll move into this now, they failed to confront some potentially vital metaphysical issues surrounding goodness and existence that have haunted the philosophical and theological tradition. So to conclude, let me speak to this briefly in light of a deeper metaphysical current that I discern in Whitehead. It's what I've called the axionoetic tradition. Okay? For this tradition, briefly, value or goodness and or mind are ontological primitives. They are irreducible parts of the fabric of reality and necessarily undergird any ultimate explanation of the nature of divine and worldly things. Note that Sjöstedt-Hughes has stated that Whitehead's God is neither based on nor congruent with morality or scripture, but with metaphysical necessity. But what is the nature of this metaphysical necessity? Or put differently, what is it that grounds divine necessity for Whitehead? That God is necessarily good limited by goodness, and founded in value at least might give us a clue. Divine necessity for Whitehead might be said to be not purely logical in nature, but axiological in nature. The idealist philosopher A.C. Ewing argued compellingly that God's necessity is not to be conceived in terms of logical necessity. And in part, he's agreeing with and responding to a larger argument Kant makes, Kant's fatal objection, he says, on this point. Might not God be necessary in some sense other than that in which his necessity would mean there was an internal contradiction in denying his existence? Ewing asks. In offering an explanation in terms of values, Ewing insists that God's existence will be necessary not because there would be any internal self-contradiction in denying it, but because it was supremely good that God should exist. Now, that goodness itself grounds in some way divine necessity has been conceptualized most vigorously in John Leslie's axiarchism, where ethical needs or requirements are themselves creatively effective in eternally grounding the existence of God and the world. These requirements can be conceived to be internal to and eternally satisfied by the divine nature. For Leslie too, then, God and the world ultimately exist because it's supremely good that they should. These statements, I would argue, although challenging, are not utterly foreign to the axiological thrust of Whitehead's universe. As Leslie rightly recognizes, Whitehead supports axiarchism with vigor. Indeed, Whitehead does insist that value conditions all ultimate explanations, that all ultimate reasons are in terms of an aim at value. So on his proposal, I don't think it's unreasonable to see God's own reason as a preeminent exemplification of this final axiological claim, namely that it is only goodness that can coherently necessitate divine existence. Now, this resonance between Leslie and Whitehead has also been recognized by Roland Faber in commenting on Leslie's claim that the reason there is something at all is because it ought to be. Faber states, this is a marvelous argument, and one could even read Whitehead's claim that God is limited by goodness in this way, that it is goodness through which God exists. So goodness in this sense is ultimately justifying. It's what Whitehead describes as the ultimate qualification not to be analyzed in terms of anything more final than itself. So although unique and challenging, and I'll be wrapping up here, it's not unjust or disingenuous, I think, to locate Whitehead's God among the wider axionoetic current of Western philosophical theology, nor, should I stress, is this interpretation inherently Christian. While it certainly finds expression in the Christian tradition in the form of Plato, Aristotle, Plotinus, others, it's in fact pre-Christian and pagan, if you want to give it that term. So will this satisfy Basel and Sjöstedt-Hughes? We'll perhaps see. Debate can and certainly will continue on these various themes entertained in the discussion, and I'll conclude then with a final thought. So within this interpretive framework, speculative as it is, what can it finally mean to deny God's goodness if one follows Whitehead in holding that God's nature expresses necessary goodness? That goodness is God's counter-agathic ecological limitation, and that God's existence is ultimately founded in value. In light of these admittedly challenging claims, I would submit that if God is anything less than the final expression of this axiologic of goodness, then God would have no reason for being at all, and a world such as ours would have never emerged. Moreover, as just a final comment, I think in affirming this, we acknowledge and in some way honor one of the most important Platonic footnotes that belongs to Whitehead's philosophical theology. Thank you very much.
All right. So I'm sure there are some questions.
Yeah, Matt.
Thank you, Andrew. I wish Peter were here
What?
to
Respond.
It would be fun to see that exchange. So, I wonder what you think of this.
Okay.
Goodness as well as truth and beauty, I think, are only really relevant when we're talking about the God-world relationship. If we're only talking about the primordial nature, truth, goodness, these don't make sense. There's no context within which truth or goodness or beauty could be pronounced or experienced. But in the relationship between God and the world, and thus in the consequent nature of the world, yes, God is clearly good and beautiful and true, the condition for these things. And so it's, again, this trouble of thinking the two poles of the divine together, which is, when I feel like I have some intuition of how this works, it is almost ecstatic, but then I lose it, and it's difficult to logically wrong, right? So if the primordial nature evokes intensities and is thus neither good nor evil, but just trying to give some relevance to the infinite potentialities that would otherwise drown finite occasions and overwhelming them. So that the primordial nature evokes intensities. It's the consequent nature that saves what can be saved, and so realizes a kind of tragic beauty. Mm-hmm. And so it's God's witness, in turn, God's consequent nature being with the world, socializes these novel intensities evoked by the primordial nature without stifling the creative advance of individuals, moment by moment, right? So God only becomes good by existing together with the world. God is not good independent of the world. God becomes good with the world. How does that sound to you?
I mean, I just think that sounds great. Yeah. No, really, I mean, so you can't abstract the world, ultimately, from God, just in the same way you can't abstract the primordial and consequent natures. Like, so I question a little bit when we say, well, the primordial nature is neither good nor evil. That's a statement speaking of it in abstraction from the consequent nature. And so like Whitehead's relations are always mutual, whether with internal to God or between God and the world. And I agree, it's very hard to deal with that. And he admits it too, the A.H. Johnson, he says, I wobbled on that point. Well, he made it seem as if though God is only this primordial nature. And I think he does that quite a bit. But value or goodness, if we're to use Leslie as an interpretive framework for Whitehead, yes, there is no, value or goodness necessarily is expressed in a God-world complex. I admit it's fully challenging, but it's a sort of proposition for feeling into what the claim of worth of being is when it comes to these two things.
It's a proposition to say God is good, and in the primordial nature there are no propositions there, because there's nothing actual to compare to the possible. Right, so, yeah.
Okay. But again, but primordial, we always flip it to the consequent too. We we see it. So
maybe the wavering is part of it.
Yeah. Michael, please.
I'm going to reiterate, it's the same point. I thought you'd sort of taken on board or agreed, not conceded, but then you flipped back again. So I'm going to try and say what reaffirm your point. Slightly differently. Peter, as I'm going to call him because I can't pronounce his surname.
I did my best.
I
Sorry, Peter.
When you're critiquing Peter for invoking the evil, the bad, whatever, in saying, no, there's the goodness, which is what you're invoking, it's too late in the game. That's a cosmological outcome. If you really want the metaphysical side, and this is just talking about the primordial, the point of God at this point, I mean, with God being a derivative notion, is to allow for goodness. For there to be good things and for there to be evil things, God has to do the infinite unconditioned conceptual valuation once. And it has to be with absolutely no preconception of what could be good and what could be bad. So both you and Peter need to take the step back and allow for there to be no judgment in God as to anything to be good or bad. I'm sorry, you put it better than I did, but I'm sort of reasserting it that the way you've set there will be goodness later, and whether that's to do with good and the consequent nature, that is a later part of the argument, right? But just the way you've set up the paper in saying Peter bad because he says bad, me good because I'm allowed good. You could make that kind of argument, but later on, because you're actually undermining the sort of the strength of the metaphysical aspect of the primordial nature of God, which is to be outside any consideration of goodness, evil, which is scary, but you've got the consequent nature to allow you to do that. But to keep it in the consequent nature, don't bring it back into the primordial nature. Would be, I think.
So what, Michael?
Necessity. That's what you want to argue.
What is the basis of divine necessity in Whitehead's scheme? That is widely open for debate. But what do you do with statements? The divine nature is limited by goodness.
Yeah, in the world, and the goodness comes in the world, not from God. The
Sure.
goodness.
Sure.
Yeah.
But I'm saying, but my speculative metaphysical interpretation is that value is the context in which the God world complex itself emerges. Right. So, do you think Whitehead thought God was good? Would you make the kind of claims that have been made in this presentation on the negative side?
My position, because I don't want to get into, my position on God is that he's not mentioned between page 20 and 30 in the speculative scheme, and he's a derivative notion like the extensive continuum. God and the extensive continuum are both derivative notions. So he starts the section with some derivative notions, and that's when you start finding out what God's like, but he's not part of the speculative scheme, he's not part of the category. So,
Okay.
So when we're talking about the existence of God, it's like perception. It's not my bag, it's not my thing, God's not my thing. Do you know what I mean? But I love the fact that of the world, in the consequent, that's when you can talk about goodness. But goodness comes not from God, and evil come in and of the world. God's infinite conceptual valuation enables or allows for, like this extensive continuum, allows for eternal objects to do their stuff. It allows for it, but it, he, she, they, whatever, God is neither good nor bad, they are prior to. Otherwise, that's mine.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. I think it's problematic. I think it's more nuanced than Whitehead. So I think you, Michael, have to say, so
Whitehead, looking for the passage you were doing all the way through.
It's very hard. Randy and I argued about it the other night. Whitehead says to A.H. Johnson, you may not believe it, and to Hawking, it's an early text, right? That God's not in the categorical notions, but Whitehead says God should have been. Okay? There's another statement he makes to Hawking, not Stephen Hawking, mind you, though that would be interesting. You must put that he brought God in to show that he belonged, and then he follows it saying you must put everything into the foundation, rather than in some sense bringing it Deus ex machina.
Well, actual entity is a major category, and God's
and that's another great point.
Exemplifications of an actual entity.
So it's an implicit inclusion of God within the categorical scheme. Is that what you say?
All alongside all other actual entities.
Yeah. So, notwithstanding both these points, I admit it's very complicated. I don't think either of them show that God's not good.
If you equivocate about God, then sure, we could say just God is good. But Whitehead has this distinction, and so that's where it gets complicated.
Sure. He didn't give us clean answers on divine necessity, and we can read it in multiple ways. I'm trying to do it creatively. And if you want more, Mind, Value, and Cosmos was where I fleshed this out.
Only 1999.
Are we doing okay on time?
Other questions?
Okay,
A few minutes, I think.
Sure. I fully admit that it's layered and very challenging.
Thank God he didn't settle it for us, so we can have these fun conversations.
Yeah, and I hope you discern no dogmatism in what I'm putting out.
No, I'm trying to put it in a nice way. Is the way you're putting it strangely opens the door to people like Peter to come back. That's part of what I'm trying to get at. Is if you say God's good, they say no, he's evil. And if there's a way of putting it, which to say you understand, such questions come later.
Yeah.
If you say something,
And
a more positive, helpful, not
Sure, yeah, and Peter's certainly operating out of experiential domains of psychedelic phenomena, which sometimes are not all good, right? So I want to admit that. And there's the distinction between someone thinking Whitehead's God is good, or dealing with that claim and then just simply not believing it. It's not true for them. There's the claim as to whether Whitehead himself thought his God was good. I think so, but there's all these distinction layers at play, which I fully admit. So, sorry.
So I was surprised that you do some troubles around problem of the evil. I understand process theology as an answer to this problem. So I think process theologians are the closest to solve the problem of the evil. And Whitehead himself put it like that, we should reduce omnipotence instead of, because we would like to keep the goodness in him. And we should make him as a fellow sufferer. And we could serve like this. So I think process theology is really close to solve the problem of evil. And you put it somehow, you open up discussion and makes troubles around.
Yeah, but if God is not good, the problem of evil is solved.
Well, also.
Because the basis of the problem of evil is trying to justify God's goodness.
We still have a problem.
Right? Well, absolutely, we still have the
Although
problem,
I
but
guess-
the theological problem proper
Yeah.
seems to dissolve, you know?
And sorry, you mix up the ontological, the metaphysical, and the moral surfaces in each other. So you have right in the process in reality. It's really they are separate from each other. So I was really happy of your comments. So I think it's the problem is not
I think
there.
there's something profoundly participatory about the goodness of God. It's like, if it is related to the consummate nature, so the God-world relationship, then is God good? Well, that kind of depends on how we respond to the call.
Does it? If the world is good, depends on how we respond to the call in some way. But so, I mean, it might be not a proper context to ask the question, but what's the reason for Whitehead's God? It's a question about divine necessity. It's challenging and annoying, but I love it, you know? So he wouldn't put it that way, but he gives hints and indications that you might be able to read an axiological based divine necessity, and you can draw it back in the tradition too. And it's very different among different thinkers, but that mind or that value in some sense grounds the reason for being. I find quite compelling. So I'm being creative.
Yeah, but now I feel like you just equated value and goodness.
Well, yeah, that means we have to be careful, and that's my downfall in the book, Mind, Value, Cosmos, right? But again, Whitehead uses value in all different manner of ways. What does it mean?
I feel like value is wider than goodness. Maybe it's like a particular.
Well, sure, because there's aesthetic values, there's moral values, there's rational values, there's ethical values.
Goodness.
That's my question. What is goodness? What is the good, especially?
We're going to move from that now. Don't make me answer. Yeah.
Well, I have a last question.
Okay.
Yeah.
You started by saying is process thinking romanticizing God, and I think there is a kind of romanticizing, but not with respect to this question of goodness. Sophia's message was, it's up to us to heal us and the world. Yeah, I think this is romanticizing, but Whitehead's message is God will heal everything because he rescues everything that can be rescued. And this is romanticizing reality, I think, because there's no empirical evidence for this claim. It's just wishful thinking.
Yeah. It's not obvious what would count as empirical evidence for the claim too. So Basil, when he says, he sort of seems annoyed that Whitehead's God, doesn't say to us before bad things happen.
Yeah.
Fair enough. We want bad things to be stopped before they happen. It's not the kind of world we live in. But Whitehead used poetic, romantic, theopoetic language.
Yeah.
He also loved the romantic poets and the nature poets.
Yeah.
Not because everything they said was precisely on point, because there's an intuition involved that was linked to the nature of things in some way. Process eschatology is difficult, and that's a different kind of conversation. There's been a lot written on it, but yeah, it's not by any means settled. I don't think it was settled for Whitehead, even though he has an eschatology at the end of process and reality of some kind.
Yeah.
When you talk about good, it also sounds like an absolute. What about like degrees of goodness? Is it possible that God could be more good? Or is it sort of God is maximally good? I'm just curious on how that plays out.
That's a good question. My knee-jerk reaction is no. Nothing but, I don't like the word absolute, nothing but a supremely worthwhile being, or a supremely worthwhile mode of existence could justify that existence in some way. So I think God is
supremely good.
I think God is supremely good. I think,
Goodness.
absolute, I don't like that language, but I think goodness is objective. And I think that's the context in which we struggle through aesthetic and moral claims. Now, on aesthetic values, certainly there's levels of aesthetic achievement. Then the eco-theology folks, Griffin and others have made the claim, right, that because there's hierarchies of value and intensity, right, we may or may not have obligations to things above or below us. I think goodness comes at a high evolutionary level. People can be more or less good, but I think you don't want to give that claim to God. And I think the classical tradition would help us here a bit. I don't think Whitehead completely rejected the classical tradition.
Okay, that's all
All right. Thank you very much. Let's continue the conversation.